we want to talk about the international fisher effect. But before we talk, I think one thing you see is that we talked about the interest rate parity, and now we talked about the purchasing power parity. And what we see is that all said and done, the interest rate parity does hold exactly. Okay, so that has to hold exactly. On the other hand, the purchasing power parity, I think, although it may not hold exactly, I think you might find this type of relation take place over. So, as an example, here, say that it was around 35. It was around 45. But usually, whenever I go home, I try to stitch some pants, and the reason being that it's relatively cheap. I can get a tailor-made dress, especially pants, and it's also relatively inexpensive. But over time, it's no longer that different. I think you can buy a pant here, a good one may be cheaper. And one of the reasons being that inflation has been very high. So over time, prices of goods have gone up very much. And to me, it seems like the currency had to go down, but still it did not. But I think last year, maybe the year before, it went quite a bit. It went to 60. So what we are saying is that in the short term, things may not happen, but at least in the long term, you might find it may not hold exactly, but overall, the relationship we talk about here should take place. That is, if you are in a country that has high inflation, you can expect the currency to go down. And that's one of the reasons why, as you said before, whenever we talk about capital budgeting and so on, companies try to do 2 or 3 ways, and usually that would be the forward price. And the good thing about the forward price is that it's a market price. Okay, that is something based upon like a consensus regarding the future exchange rate. At the same time, another way to look at that is to use the purchasing power parity, and that talks about where the currency should be, okay, based upon the relative inflation and so on. Now, why do you think that the interest rate parity does hold exactly while the purchasing power parity may not hold exactly? Or may not even hold? Why is that?
Both take advantage of differences in interest rates. Our parity, so it'll adjust.
Why is that? How is that? So that is a big difference. So in the case of the interest rate parity, whenever that is violated, chances are people have the ability to make money out of that. So there they have an arbitrage opportunity, and they will try to exploit that and make money out of that. On the other hand, say that price of price in India or 75% more in China, you still cannot do much anything about that, because you cannot buy a car here and take it all the way. Either you have to pay a lot of money in duties, or you might end up in trouble, a lot of trouble. So that's the main reason why, even if you find that this, you just cannot exploit. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why this does not hold. Okay. Now, what about the international fisher effect? I think it's very similar to the purchasing power parity. So the international fisher effect suggests that the nominal interest rate contains 2 components, the real rate plus the inflation. That's what we talked about. And implications of the international fisher effect: currencies with high interest rates will have high expected inflation and will be expected to depreciate. So all said and done, what we are saying is that the real rate is pretty stable across countries. So what really makes a difference is the inflation. And here, what does it mean for foreign investors? Foreign investors will be adversely affected by the effects of relatively high inflation rate if they try to capitalize on high US interest rates. Okay, so basically what we are saying is that if you look at countries with high interest rates, you think you might get a better deal. Okay, so again, as an example, I know a family, they were 2 brothers, they were from India, they've been here for a long time, so they had a software business, they sold it, I don't know, maybe they got 10 million or 20 million US dollars, so they are relatively wealthy, and I think both of them pretty much retired. They were helping their kids, and both of them went to UPenn and stuff like that, so they are very successful. So one of the issues they had was where to put the money. And one of them was talking to me, and they were saying, somebody was advising, you put your money in India, you could get 8% more, and so on. But what we see here, at least based upon the Fisher effect, is that chances are, if you get 5% more in India, by the time you bring your money back, there's a good chance the US dollar will have gone up by that 5%. So that is basically what is predicted by the international Fisher effect. Now the same thing to companies. Okay, so one of the cases you have is that is Carrefour. Okay, so Carrefour talks about a European company. They are making a big bond issue, I don't know, maybe $3 billion or $4 billion. And in that case, just like we talked about, the investing, the second question is financing. So if you want to make a big bond issue like this, you want to shop around. And in that case, the Carrefour, they are looking at Switzerland, they are looking at Europe, they are looking at the UK, and they are looking at the US. And the question there is that, where is the cheapest place to borrow money? And initially, just we see here, I think in Swiss francs, the interest rate was, I think, 3.5%. So very cheap. But what the case shows is that after you adjust for the exchange rate, most of those savings will go away. And that basically comes from the international effect, that is, countries with high interest rates, you can expect the currency to depreciate. Or if you look at countries with low interest rates, like Switzerland, you can expect the currency to appreciate. So that's what we see here in the case of the international Fisher effect. So it's very similar. So what we see here is that the change in the exchange rate is given by 1 plus the interest rate in the US divided by 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign country minus 1. Or if you look at the change in the exchange rate, that is given by the difference in the norm rate. So this is pretty much the same as the purchasing for parity. The main difference is, in this case, we have the nominal interest rate and inflation. So an example of that, today's spot rate of the Mexican peso is 0.1. Purchasing for parity holds. The US inflation over this year is expected to be 7%, while the Mexican inflation is 3%. Wake Forest Company plans to import from Mexico and will need 30 million pesos in 1 year. Determine the expected amount of dollars to be paid by the Wake Forest Company for the pesos in 1 year. So if real rate is 2% and IFE holds, what is the expected spot rate? Okay. So if you are using okay, so Wake Forest, okay. If the purchasing power parity holds, what do you think would be the exchange rate? And based upon the exchange rate, if they have to make the 20 million pesos, how much is it going to cost them? So the first thing is you want to figure out what is going to be the future spot rate based upon the purchasing power parity. You can also use the international Fisher effect. You could do it a couple of ways to see what is going to happen to the exchange rate. So we can use this relationship to forecast the future spot rate, isn't it? So we are given the current exchange rate, okay? We are given the inflation in the US, and we are also given the inflation in Mexico. So based upon that, we can forecast the future spot rate. So once we have that, we need 20 million pesos. You can figure out how much it is going to cost you, okay? So what do you think would be the answer here?
What is the
0.103? Okay, so if you look at this, the inflation in the US is 7%, the inflation in Mexico is 3%. So this tells you that either the exchange rate should change by 3.8835%, or the future spot rate is going to be 0.10388. Okay? So this tells you the future spot rate, and if you have to pay 20 million pesos, this tells you how much it is going to cost you. Okay, so here we are using the inflation to predict the future spot rate. if you're going to use a 2% real rate, again, we can use the International Fisher effect to do the same thing. Okay? So in that case, the interest rate in the US is going to be, what, 9%, okay? And it's going to be 5%. So we can use the same relationship to predict the future spot rate. So this is going to be 0.0 times So this is basically what the International Fisher effect would predict regarding the future spot rate. So what would be the answer? I think it's pretty similar, but I don't know what exactly. $0.10380. Okay. So I think the answers you get are very similar, isn't it? So based upon the purchasing power parity and based upon the International Fisher effect, the answers are very similar. Now this basically talks about all three. This talks about the International Fisher effect and how it affects the exchange rates. So it's a very similar story. So relatively high local interest rates, relatively high inflation, and because of that, all the things we talked about earlier would work, okay? And relatively low interest rates, low inflation, imports will increase, imports will decrease, exports will increase, and the currency should appreciate. In some ways, these are very closely related to each other, okay? And just like before, it talks about the interest rate and the exchange rate. What we have here is we have the interest rate on the y-axis and the x-axis. So the relationship is very similar to what we talked about, okay? Compare the interest rate parity, the purchasing power parity, and the International Fisher effect. How does it look like? So what we see here is, when you look at the interest rate differential, we have the interest rate parity, okay? And then we have the International Fisher effect, and we also have the Fisher effect. Okay? Okay, what I want to do is I just want to write out these three relationships, and then we want to talk about that. is the interest rate parity, okay? This is the purchasing power parity, and this is the international Fisher effect. So this summarizes the three things we talked about. So in the case of the interest rate parity, we have the forward price over the spot exchange rate. Okay? In the case of the purchasing power parity, we have the expected spot price over the current spot price, and in the case of the international Fisher effect, we have the expected spot price divided by the current spot price. So this is what we see for the three cases. Now, how are they similar? So when we compare the interest rate parity with the international Fisher effect, what you see is the right-hand side is the same, isn't it? So in both cases, the right-hand side, we have the interest rates, isn't it? So that is 1 plus the interest rate in the US divided by 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign country. So the right-hand side is the same. What do you think should be the left-hand side?
Expected, but instead of forward rate, we have the expected,
So what does it mean?
which means that it's combination of interest rate parity and
So in terms of math, the right-hand side is the same, the denominator is the same, which basically means that the numerator has to be the same, isn't it? So all said and done, what we are saying here is that the forward price should be the same as the expected spot price. Now that same thing is true for almost anything when you talk about what is the relationship between the forward price and the future spot price. Typically what people say is that the forward price is the best predictor of the future spot rate. So that's the key there, and that's pretty much what we are saying. So all said and done, there is not much difference between this one and the international Fisher effect. The big difference is that the forward price, we can do something about that, perhaps by by converting and so on, you can have an arbitrage opportunity. But in this case, we really don't know what is the expected spot. We really cannot do much about that. So that is a big difference. Here, even today, you know both these numbers, okay? You know the forward price, you know the spot price, which means that you can profit from that. But here, we really don't know what is the expected spot price, meaning we cannot really predict what the spot price is going to be correctly, okay? And in the last case, the international Fisher effect, when you compare with the purchasing power parity, what is the difference? The left-hand side is the same. What is the difference in the right-hand side? So basically what we have is, in the case of the purchasing power parity, we have the inflation. In the case of the international Fisher effect, we have the nominal interest rate. Now basically what we said before was that when you look at the nominal interest rate, it consists of the real rate plus the inflation. Now here, what we are assuming is that the real rate is the same, which basically means that the only difference is going to be the difference in the inflation. So that basically, all these become almost very much similar. That is, the purchasing power parity and the international Fisher effect are very similar, because all said and done, the only difference between the two is one is inflation and the other is nominal interest rate. But if the real rate is going to be the same, there should not be any difference between the two. And I think the last slide which we have here, basically it looks at different countries. I think this took place in 97-98 when there was a big Asian currency crisis. And the primary reason why that crisis took place was because of the high inflation in those countries. And what we see here is that at the time, the Indonesian currency, it declined by 84%. The Singapore dollar went down by 15%. India went down by 41%, and so on. So, and that ignited an economic crisis all over the world. And here, the primary reason why that happened is because of the high inflation in those countries, and so on. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to take a small break, and I'm going to come and do some problems based upon these two. You might not have the questions. We'll go through that and then I'll post it online. Okay? Because I think it's important. These are two very important chapters. You also have a couple of assignments, so I'd like to take a break and come back and go through that. Okay?